Christians get out and vote. Just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You got to get out and vote.
That was Donald Trump telling an audience that they wouldn't have to vote anymore while pandering to an audience of Christians. Between Republicans passing laws mandating that the 10 Commandments be shown in classrooms, abortion bans, and even Mike Johnson calling the separation of church and state a misnomer, Christian nationalism is clearly on the rise by Republicans, which brings us to a very timely episode of Class with Jamie Raskin, where the congressman here will debunk right-wing constitutional fallacies and fever dreams. And today, he's going to take on this notion that America is a white Christian nation where the Bible is supreme and superior to the Constitution. So, Congressman, the floor is yours.
Well, that is the heart of white Christian nationalism. And we have seen it rear its ugly head in a lot of places, including on January 6, 2021. We get lots of manifestations of it in Project 2025. And of course, Donald Trump's outbursts encode that basic message that we'll get through this democracy thing quickly enough, and then we'll get back to having the right people rule. So what we're going to look at today is the fallacy that America is a white Christian nation where the Bible is dominant and supreme to the Constitution. But I want to look at both parts of it, that America is a Christian nation and that America is a white nation. Let's start with the claim that America is a Christian nation. And there's only one sense, and one sense only, in which this is even arguably or even weakly true, which is in the purely demographic sense, where it could be said, well, you know, America has 332 million people, and more than 200 million of them are Christian. Therefore, if you've got nearly 2/3 of Americans who are Christian, America's a Christian nation. And you could, you know, perform a similar operation with race and say, you know, of those 332 million people, something around 70% of those people are white, maybe 63 or 64% would define themselves in the census as only white and not white and something else. But in any event, a majority of the people would call themselves white in some sense, and therefore it's a white nation. Well, you know, if you want to use that kind of demographic circular reasoning, that tautology, and that does something for you, I suppose you can go ahead and say it. But of course, there's nothing which freezes the population either in terms of religion or race. And it's predicted that America won't be a majority white country in 25 years. And I guess even in that narrow, limited demographic sense, it wouldn't even be true. But all of that is really beside the point, because although they sometimes will hide behind that tent, we know that when they say America is a Christian country or a white country, they're making an assertion about the nature of our social contract and about the nature of our Constitution, and it's just wrong. Oftentimes it's wrapped in historical claims. Those claims are overwhelmingly wrong as well. And then when those constitutional assertions are converted into political and moral claims, well, at that point, the normative argument clearly becomes a racist one. So let's go back to the beginning and let's look at the nature of the American Revolution and then the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution to see whether there's any basis for this claim that America is a Christian country. Well, to begin with, the leaders of the American Revolution, the intellectual and political leaders, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and James Madison and Tom Paine, these people were Enlightenment liberals who wanted to rebel against centuries of religious superstition, state-imposed religion, religion-controlled government, and theocracy. They were opposed to centuries of religious warfare between the Catholics and the Protestants, which were every bit as bloody and vicious as the wars between the Shia and the Sunni today in the Muslim world. And they wanted to oppose Holy Crusades, Inquisition, witchcraft trials, the whole apparatus of religious persecution, which they wanted to leave in the Middle Ages and did not think belonged in a period of modern democratic enlightenment. And so they set about creating a government that radically separated church and state. And as Madison would put it in his famous remonstrance against religious taxation, that left matters of faith to each individual, to each man and woman to decide for himself or herself what their relationship to God would be without the government intervening and getting involved and compelling people to worship a particular way or pray a particular way or pay taxes or tithes to particular churches and religions and so on. So the Declaration of Independence does not mention the word God. It does talk about a creator, and the dominant themes of the Declaration of Independence are that we are endowed by our creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and unalienable rights, and that the only legitimating principle for government is the consent of the governed, the people themselves, that the right to rule does not come from God or come from a church, but it comes from the consent of the governed, the people ourselves. And all men, of course, we would translate it today as all men and women, but all men are created equal. So you have in the Declaration of Independence the elucidation of the basic themes of equality, liberty, and freedom, and democracy, the consent of the governed, as being the essential legitimating principles for governance. And that was the basic concept of the Declaration of Independence, which of course set forth a bill of particulars against the king, who claimed to rule with divine right and an established church. But the American Revolution wanted to topple all of that. And that becomes clear when we get to the Constitution. Of course, there were iterative drafts between the Declaration and the Constitution. There were Articles of Association, there were Articles of Confederation. Again, none of those mention God, much less Christianity or an established church. And when we get to the Constitution, the preamble is anchored in the democratic principle itself. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and preserve to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty, do hereby ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States. And you see what's happening there. The government, the Constitution, are both founded by the people themselves. And before that point, human beings had been ruled by kings and queens and lords and emperors and empresses and czars, all of them ruling by divine right. They got their power directly from God. Our forefathers and foremothers flipped the whole thing upside down, and they began not with God and the king, but rather with we the people. So that was the basic structure of the democratic public philosophy that's advanced inside the Constitution. And then, of course, Article 1 establishes that all legislative power rests with the people, not with a monarch or even with a president who somehow has higher consciousness and communion with God. And remember, the presidency was only added to the Constitution later. It was not, there was no president in the Articles of Confederation, but the idea was we needed somebody to keep things going between sessions of Congress and to act with energy to implement the laws and the will of the people. But the principal job of the president was to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, but not to act as a king, not to be above the Constitution or above the people. Now, I know that all of that has been thrown into doubt by the neo-monarchical hallucinations and rulings of the Roberts Court now, which does seem to want to elevate the president, who they imagined was going to be Donald Trump. But I think they're getting their comeuppance right now because democracy is resilient and strong. But I digress. But in any event, the president, like the Supreme Court, also operated simply as manifestations of the public will, and then the structuring of checks and balances within a system of representative government. But the key passages that actually talk about religion are, of course, in the First Amendment and in Article 6. And that's what everybody needs to know. And that's pretty much the beginning and the end of the story. I mean, we can spend a lot of time going through the case law and seeing how the Supreme Court has spelled it out over the centuries. But look what you get in the very First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. No establishment of a church. That's a radical break from England and from all prior governments, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's up to you. It is your individual right of conscience that matters in a society based on democratic freedom, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the First Amendment is all about sovereignty of mind, your intellectual freedom to make your own decisions about what you believe, what you say, whether you want to assemble, how you want to organize yourself in terms of the politics of society. But it begins with religious freedom, that you cannot be compelled to worship a particular way, to participate in a particular church or any church at all, to pay taxes for ministers or imams or rabbis. None of that is acceptable. So that's the First Amendment. But then you got to go to Article 6, where the point is made, even more forcefully by the founders. And if you go to Article 6, it says, the senators and representatives and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, a principle we've encountered before when we looked at Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, explicit language saying if you engage in insurrection, having pledged to uphold and defend the Constitution, you can never hold federal or state office again. The passage that that MAGA and this Supreme Court have wanted to read out of the Constitution. But in any event, it goes on to say, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. No religious tests for public office. So what do we have? No establishment of religion, religious liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, and no religious tests for public office can ever be created at the federal or the state level. Okay, that would seem to be overwhelming textual refutation of the claim that we are a religious country, or we are a Christian country, or we are a Christian country of a particular denomination. And all of American history incorporates and encodes an elaboration of these basic principles. Now, I'm not saying it's always been easy. It hasn't. It's always been a struggle. It continues to be a struggle. It's going on right now with respect to the Ten Commandments. I think Louisiana just adopted a law requiring the posting of the Ten Commandments in every public school classroom, which is a head-on collision with a Supreme Court decision rendered in 1980 called Stone versus Graham, which struck down a state law mandating the posting of the Ten Commandments in every classroom. Although in that case, the Ten Commandments displays were supposed to be paid for by private money, which the court majority quickly ruled was totally irrelevant. That didn't sanitize it. In some sense, that made it worse, that attempted alibi by saying, oh, it was paid for by private money. But of course, the display itself was very clearly an endorsement of a particular religious test. And yet, this Ten Commandments thing is sweeping the red states, Brian. We've had members come into the House Judiciary Committee and say, oh, we should go ahead and endorse the Ten Commandments, just like Texas just endorsed the Ten Commandments. Louisiana just endorsed the Ten Commandments. And I said, the Ten Commandments have been doing fine for millennia without an endorsement from the House Freedom Caucus or the House of Representatives. No, they say the Ten Commandments are the cornerstone, the foundation of the Bill of Rights. Really, the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other God before me. The First Amendment is that there shall be no establishment of religion and freedom of religious worship, right? So how is that religious directive in a particular monotheistic religion the basis for saying there shall be religious freedom? If anything, our framers, in their irreverent way, set up a First Amendment which directly collides with the First Commandment. And most of those commandments, or a lot of those commandments, are of a theological nature and have nothing to do with anything that you would find in the Bill of Rights. That would be an interesting homework assignment for all of our readers. Take out the 10 Commandments and take out the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, and compare them and see if they really match up one for one. I don't think so. I ended up going to the Rules Committee and saying, if they're going to make the House of Representatives vote on the 10 Commandments, we should have to vote on each commandment separately and not get away with the omnibus package. And you can't vote for any commandment you've ever violated yourself, because then you'll be taking the name of the Lord in vain in violation of the third commandment. So this is precisely what the framers didn't want us to do. They didn't want people to get together in the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate or a state legislature or a school board and start fighting about religion. Like, everybody has the right to worship as they please, but that's not what public space is for and government is for. We do not live in a theocracy, and we do not live in a Christian nation. We live in a nation that is built on the principles of constitutional democracy and freedom for everybody. And just as that applies in the religious context, it applies in the racial context, except it's a little bit more complicated there, Brian, because we were, one would say, a nation built on white supremacy. And for that proposition, you can go and read the Dred Scott decision in 1857. And Dred Scott was a slave, an enslaved human being who was brought into free territory and then tried to bring a suit against his master for his freedom, Dred Scott versus Sanford, and yet a pro-racist, pro-slavery Supreme Court ruled that there was no federal court jurisdiction under Article 3, where you need to have diversity, meaning a citizen from one state suing a citizen from another state. And the Supreme Court held that that an enslaved person, an enslaved African person, or his progeny could never be a citizen within the meaning of the diversity jurisdiction clause. Why? Well, it was an argument actually about original intent and original understanding, that under the original contemplation of the founders, said the Supreme Court, this was set up as a white man's compact. The Constitution was for white men only, and the African slave had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. So that would be a more plausible argument before the Civil War, that this was a white man's nation. But the Civil War changed all of that. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment established equal protection and due process, and established that everybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. And the 15th Amendment banned race discrimination in voting. Now, it worked for a while under Reconstruction. Then there was terrible racist backsliding in the southern states, and the so-called redemption with the repeal of Reconstruction and the war on Reconstruction. And a lot of the political rights and voting rights, certainly, that were gained by the emancipated black population were lost at that point, and only to be recovered after the modern civil rights movement took place nearly a century later. But in any event, constitutionally, we are not a white supremacist country. We are a country that, in the Reconstruction process and with those amendments, tried to purge the filth of Dred Scott and white supremacy from the Constitution, and to take positive action to extend rights to people who had been denied rights for so long. That has been an historical struggle. That's what the Civil Rights Act was all about in 1964. That's what the Voting Rights Act was all about in 1965. And it's still a seesaw struggle today. And we have, again, a right-wing Supreme Court, which in cases like Shaw versus Reno, 1993, Miller versus Johnson, has been dismantling majority black and majority Hispanic congressional districts and state legislative districts, saying you cannot have a bizarrely drawn majority black district, but of course, if it's a bizarrely drawn majority white district, it's totally okay. That is unequal protection. And those are some of the kinds of inequalities that have been reintegrated into the law through a right-wing Supreme Court. And today, of course, the Equal Protection Clause does work best for white people challenging affirmative action or having to endure the indignity from their perspective of living in a majority black congressional district than it works for the intended beneficiaries of the 14th Amendment. But still, I would say we've made tremendous progress, basically through the struggle of the people. That's still going on today. And the vast majority of the American people embrace the real constitutional ethos that emerges from the Reconstruction period, which is that we are not a white supremacist nation. We are not a white nation. We are a nation of immigrants, and we're a nation of people who were brought over as enslaved human beings, but are now obviously a central part of the political, social, and cultural fabric of the country. So these issues continue to be fought about, but it cannot be said with a straight face that we are a white Christian nation. And we know when they say that, that's a statement of their aspiration and ambition. It's not a statement of constitutional reality.
Well, that is another constitutional fallacy debunked. I've got questions, Congressman, but first, just a quick note. We always try to use this opportunity for these classes to promote a cause that the Congressman is working on. So as always, Congressman, can you speak about Democracy Summer?
Well, so we've got more than 1,000 young people across the country who've been deeply engaged in this campaign. And of course, everybody's been re-energized and revitalized by Kamala Harris's candidacy and by the courage and the heroism and the patriotism of President Biden, who has passed the baton to a new generation. And the reason that Democracy Summer exists is to organize this onrush of enthusiasm and participation by all of these young people. So we're getting people registered, we're getting people plugged into the campaigns all over the country. And if you want to help us out in Democracy Summer, please follow the instructions up on the screen and you can get in touch with us. And we're raising money and we're raising volunteers, and it's very exciting to see what's going on all over the country.
And we've got one more. This time, the Congressman was kind enough to allow me to promote my upcoming book, which Representative Raskin himself actually wrote the foreword for. We've heard here a little bit about how Republicans present themselves as constitutionalists, all while acting in direct opposition to the Constitution itself, embracing Christian nationalism, for example. My book, Shameless, discusses exactly that point, how Republicans rely on their historic branding to give themselves cover to behave in conflict with their branding.
You've written a fantastic book. It's completely readable. I just digested it in one day, and it's impressive how you expose the intellectual hollowness of the MAGA position and show that it has no anchor in reality. It's got no real anchor in our history. It's a twisted and deformed view of American society, and I'm very proud to be able to endorse your book and encourage people to go out and read it.
Well, I very much appreciate that. And of course, for those watching, to pre-order, which is a great way to support this series, my work, you can click the link right here on the screen or in the post description, or check out briantylercohen.com/book. Okay, to the questions here. Congressman, so much of the pushback to the idea of separation of church and state is that the actual words separation of church and state aren't actually in the Constitution. What's your rebuttal to that?
Well, I read the words that are actually in it. In some sense, those words are even stronger. There shall be no law respecting an establishment of religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It doesn't really say anything about having a thriving, buoyant religious sector, but the idea of separation of church and state gives religion its due by Thomas Jefferson. He's saying we want not only a powerful secular state that is not wasting its time trying to interpose itself between people and their God and their sense of the infinite and the supernatural, but Jefferson is saying religion can have a very positive, meaningful influence in people's lives, and it doesn't help for the state to get involved. There's some beautiful language about this, by the way. I printed out before I came Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance against religious taxation, which I mentioned before. There's a beautiful question. He says, during almost 15 centuries, has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial? In other words, we've been trying official establishment Christian churches for 15 centuries. What have been its fruits, says Madison? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. In other words, the churches don't have to go out and compete by having better theology, so they get puffed up on their own arrogance and their laziness. Ignorance and servility in the laity, when people are compelled to go to church, then they are turned into docile puppets of the state and church unified in that way. And then superstition, bigotry, and persecution. I think that Jefferson and Madison, those guys, had a lot of hope for the progress of religion. I mean, Jefferson made his own Bible. It was later called Jefferson's Bible. He never called it a Bible, but I think he called it the philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. And he excised from the Bible everything that he thought was based on supernatural beliefs or superstition or miracles. And he said, let's just stick with the moral preachments of Jesus Christ, which he endorsed. And so that became his Bible. He literally used glue and scissors to create, Jefferson's Bible. I think there's only a handful of copies of it left. But they believed that religion should be a human enterprise that's evolving, but it doesn't need state intervention any more than we need state intervention telling people what to think about morality or ethics or politics. That's not the proper role of the state. And religion should evolve and the state should evolve, but they should be kept separate. And a lot of sociologists will say the reason why America has the most dynamic, flourishing religious sector of any of the Western countries is precisely because we've kept the state out. I think it was Katha Pollitt, the Nation writer, who said she favors religious prayer in the schools because it will be sure to turn all of the kids off from religion. She's an atheist, and she's saying that's the surest way to alienate everybody from the religious cause.
Can you speak on the dichotomy between Republicans hiding behind Christianity to enact an agenda that is actually wholly antithetical to the teachings of Jesus, like whether regarding their refusal to fund food stamps, Medicaid, which overwhelmingly helps the elderly and the disabled, the child tax credit, which just as of this recording was just again voted down by Republicans, vilifying immigrants and refugees when Jesus himself was a refugee. How do you square these blatantly contradictory ideas?
Well, and of course, that's a debate within Christianity and within religion. And so I'm happy to enter into that discussion because it's so interesting. But of course, from a constitutional and secular perspective, there are people who want to use Christianity for repressive purposes. There are people who want to use Christianity for progressive humanistic purposes. There are people who want to use Judaism or Islam for authoritarian and repressive purposes, and there are people who want to use those religions for humanistic and liberal purposes, right? And that, of course, makes sense from an Enlightenment perspective because a religion is a human construct. From a secular perspective, those religions don't come from God. They are man-made, and so they can be used for corrupt purposes or humanitarian purposes. But your point is correct. I mean, we've got great progressive liberation thinkers within Christianity. I'm thinking about my friend Reverend Barber, who says that Jesus Christ was championing a philosophy of love and solidarity with the poor. and quotes the passages everybody knows about how it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven, and so on. So that wing of Christianity, of course, would denounce the Jerry Falwell wing, which organizes itself around contempt for gay people, hatred of the LGBTQ community, the subjugation of women, the violation of women's procreative and reproductive choice, and so on. But that version of authoritarian Christianity has been central to the authoritarian dictators and strongmen all over the world. I mean, if you look at Viktor Orban, who is held up as the hero by right-wing MAGA forces and by Donald Trump, and I think he just had a slumber party a few weekends ago over at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago spread. That's all about right-wing Christianity, putting women back in their place, stripping women of reproductive freedom, bashing gay people, bashing immigrants, and so on. And there are great Christian theologians and scholars who say that's totally antithetical to who the real Jesus was. There's a great book by Gary Wills called What Jesus Meant that would really seem to take that position as well. But here's the great thing. In American constitutional democracy, we don't have to enter into doctrinal conflict on an internecine basis within particular religions. That's for the religions to fight out. I mean, the reason why you've got like the Baptist Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention and the Methodists and the Southern Methodists and the African Methodist, AME Church, is because they all had splits over secular political subjects like slavery and civil rights and abortion, and should gay people be allowed to be married, and the religions can slice and dice themselves a million different ways. The government doesn't have to be involved in that.
Now, eventually, the Ten Commandments case will make its way to the Supreme Court, and at any other point before the last few weeks, I would have assumed that it would just go the same way as, like you mentioned before, Stone versus Graham in 1980, which was a near identical case in Kentucky, which already adjudicated this issue.
Yes.
But after this court's immunity ruling, I legitimately don't know how this court would rule, although I can say with some certainty that there would at least be 2 votes in favor of Louisiana. So what would the argument to justify that be, given how blatantly and nakedly unconstitutional it actually is?
It depends on how far back they want to roll American constitutional discourse and understanding. I mean, they could go back to the point I was mentioning before about how the 14th Amendment, through the so-called due process incorporation process, applies the no establishment of religion principle not just against Congress, which is what is stated textually, but then through the 14th Amendment also against the states. Somebody like Clarence Thomas doesn't like that doctrine. I think that Scalia and Rehnquist may have been skeptics of that doctrine too. So they might just go and say, well, Congress can't set up a religion or a church, but the states can. And so if the states can actually establish a church under that reading, certainly they can engage in the far lesser violation of people's civil liberty of just imposing the tenets of one particular religion in a public school classroom. So they might try to make that argument. They also could make the argument that, okay, even if the no establishment principle applies against the states, this is not an establishment because we are going to define establishment as only setting up an official church. And if Louisiana doesn't officially, set up the Catholic Church as the Church of Louisiana, but just puts up 10 commandments, well, that would be okay. After all, the Supreme Court has carved out other little exceptions. There's one that affects our routine in Congress called Marsh versus Chambers, which says that Congress can have a chaplain and open our daily sessions with a prayer. And it's not because, the First Amendment doesn't operate. It's simply because they say the original Congress did that and did not view it as incompatible with the First Amendment. Query whether or not that's true. And the way that those of us who are much stronger First Amendment establishment champions have tried to reconcile this is to say, well, that mini little moment of silence or meditation is one that's got to be open to people from every religious denomination, not just Christians, but Muslims and Jews and Unitarians, and but also others who will memorialize the day. I remember when I was in the state Senate in Maryland, we had the same practice, and I brought in priests, I brought in rabbis, and I brought in also musicians who thought that they had songs that they could play that would uplift and solemnize the proceedings. And so I think that makes it a little bit better. But in any event, they could carve out an exception and say that posting the Ten Commandments does not constitute an establishment or a real endorsement, especially if it's just a silent display. You can imagine something like that. But people who grew up when there was school prayer and things like Ten Commandments on the walls will tell you that it's all about sticking it to the minority groups, the people who don't agree with or don't participate in worship the same way the majority group that controls the school board does it. And there are lots of cases where Catholics are in the minority and they bring a suit against a Protestant practice, or Mormons are in the minority and they're bringing a suit against a Protestant practice or a Catholic practice, or different groups are treated like the outsider, like the scapegoat. And so many of these religious impositions are really about the majority sticking it to the minority group.
Which I guess leads me to the last question here. And this is something that's reared its head quite a bit lately, that's really come into the zeitgeist. So what is the link between Christian nationalism and fascism? Because so often it feels like they're kind of one and the same as they present themselves in this country today.
Well, it would be interesting to bring in some historians to discuss that connection in the 20th century. But the right-wing Catholic and Christian parties were generally very supportive of fascist movements in the last century. And in some sense, it's almost hard to disentangle them if you're looking at Franco in Spain or Mussolini in Italy. And of course, the Catholic Church has apologized for its involvement in facilitating fascism and not speaking out strongly against Hitler, whose birthday was observed in the Catholic Church in Germany, and whose birthday was announced regularly. So there's a long history of Christian anti-Semitism that definitely exploded in the last century, and anti-Semitism was one of the critical currents in fascist totalitarianism that Hannah Arendt identified in the origins of totalitarianism.
And of course, rearing its head as recently as Charlottesville, for example. Congressman, what can we look out for in the next episode of Class?
Yes, in our next session, we're going to take on a fallacy that is just ablaze all over the land, coming from the MAGA Republicans, which is that America is not a democracy, but a republic, and therefore equal protection does not cover the voting rights of the people and the one person, one vote principle. And the First Amendment and the freedom of speech do not protect the rights of students in public schools or public employees in the workplace and so on. But we're going to take this claim that we're not a democracy, we're a republic, and then all of the implications which they say follow from that distinction.
So you'll all be armed with exactly what to say the next time a Republican pushes this claim that actually we're not even a democracy, we are a republic. And of course, to watch that episode, please make sure to subscribe to this channel. The link to subscribe is right here on the screen and also in the post description, as well as the links for Democracy Summer and my upcoming book, Shameless. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Jamie Raskin, and make sure to check out Brian's book, Shameless. It's really fun.
This is Class with Jamie Raskin.